Since 1990, we've set up over 100 of these networks across about a third of the local authorities in the UK, and we support about 950 people. We class them as vulnerable adults. All labels are problematic to us. When we started in 1990, the main group that we worked with was what is normally classed as intellectual disability. We call it learning disabilities in the UK. The last few years, it's just been more general than that. And I guess if you wanted to put a label on the other larger group, it would probably be mental health, but I said that's problematic in itself. We're still unique in the UK. I have my theories as to why, and you can, that's another talk, but you can ask me about that. We're also very pleased, and one of the reasons I'm here is that we've worked with the Brothers of Charity in Roscommon and Nolene Fox, who's obviously also involved in the university, to support them in setting up a Keyring type network in Roscommon. And I'm going there on Monday, so it'll be really good to see the progress and what they've achieved there. And we have other sort of Keyring-like stuff around the world as well. In the UK, we're still unique. So Article 19 of the UN Act, I won't read this out because you should all know it off by heart, I think, shouldn't you? What strikes me about this is, and I guess it's a bit of a theme of the talk, is it says that state parties shall take effective and appropriate measures. And I guess for me, it's that sort of top-down application of things, which I wonder whether it has its limitations. The UN's government interpretation, as you were, of that in terms of independent living is this statement. So independent living is about disabled people having the same level of choice, control and freedom in their daily lives as any other person. And I'd just like to spend a little bit of time taking that apart, I guess, but hopefully in a constructive way. So firstly, the first bit about independent living. I was really pleased I went to a session that Sinead was speaking at yesterday, and one of the first things she said is independent living doesn't make sense, and I absolutely agree. We are interdependent. We live in societies in different forms. If you think just about me, to get to this conference, to be standing here today, I work for an organisation that somebody else had the insight to set up. And is managed with other colleagues. It's not just done by me. I got involved because other people were interested in it, and because Nolene was connected in both Brothers and Charity and the university. She linked me into this conference, and I'm standing here. But even further, I didn't walk over here. I flew with BMI to Knock, hired a car, which I arranged through somebody else. Karen organised my hotel for me. It is a ridiculous concept to think we do things independently. It doesn't work. However, what I would say is if you look at the other side of the coin, if you look at a Keyring member, and I should explain the terminology, if I refer to members, I apologise, it's what we call our service users. They're members of networks, and we prefer that term, so that's what it means. But you look on that, they probably have little choice, and certainly have had less choice before they joined Keyring. They've had less choice in terms of where they live, who they live with. And even with Keyring, most of them live in social housing areas, so they don't necessarily have a huge choice in terms of where they live now. They have much more choice than they had before, and certainly much more choice in terms of who they live with. And certainly not much choice in terms of jobs and jobs prospects, and that's really an attitudinal one. It's how historically jobs have been built up, not necessarily that they can't do elements of jobs. So independence to me is not a realistic concept. And other terms or other ways of examining it would be much more important for me. I mean, I'm not sure there is a good alternative to it. I mean, you could talk about integration. That has some merit, I think. You could talk about inclusion. I guess for me, an ambition would be indistinguishability, and I apologise for the translators for that one. But a sign of real progress. If you have an identity, a very strong identity, is often due to discrimination or oppression or a need to fight and a banner to be behind. So therefore, surely the ambition would be that you don't need that any longer. And so if you're indistinguishable from everything else, then perhaps that's the way we should be looking. The next word I use is disabled. And I hear the social model of disability bandied about quite a lot. And it's talked about a lot in the local authorities that we work with. And I mentioned we are funded largely by local authorities who purchase our service. My job, incidentally, as development director is to sell to local authorities. So I'm not an operational manager. I sell Keyring. it gets bandied about. I'm not sure they know what it means. I'm certainly not sure that they put it into practice. So just as a quick reminder, what it's saying is people are disabled because of our attitude to them. And that, for me, is so fundamental in terms of the solutions, or where we go, and perhaps where we start from. You can take two approaches, really, to people. You can take an asset or a deficit-based approach. If we look at the asset-based approach, and this is fundamental to Keyring, so this is, I suppose, our starting point in terms of how we work with people and why we think what we do works. The first thing we do is identify strengths. Now, that's an interesting one, because often if people are coming from residential care or even from parental homes, they don't think they've got any strengths or any skills. And in some ways they perhaps haven't got any skills because they haven't been allowed to have any skills. They might not even have been asked how many sugars they want in their coffee. So, you know, it can be from a low point. So we work very hard. And I guess that's where the facilitation of that use is quite important, because recognising it in the first place, recognising those skills can be transferable. You heard Jane on the video talk about they can be practical skills, they can be a good agony aunt, they can be good at transport and be a transport buddy, all sorts of things really, and bringing that out and saying, you know, you have a value and this is our starting point, not what you can't do, is an enormous difference. What it leads to is in terms of pride and confidence, and to see that manifest. So, as a charity, we are a legally constituted organisation. We're also actually a limited company. That means that our trustees are directors of the company and they are liable for that company. So it's an onerous position to be a trustee. 4 of our members, our service users, are trustees, full trustees. And if you talk to Graham, who's one of the trustees at the moment, he will say, just with immense pride, you can see him, he is glowing at the idea that he could do this. We did an exercise when we were 20 years old, a couple of years ago. We did an exercise about what would you be doing, what could you not imagine 20 years ago that would be happening now? And Graham's immediately was, I could not imagine anybody would think I was capable of doing this. So it's enormous, and you know, his contribution is that. Another example, perhaps on the more sort of frontline level, one of our members, Stephen, was told that he, absolutely categorically, he could not live outside residential care. And he fought very, very hard. And eventually, with our support, he moved into a Keyring network. And because they didn't think he was capable of doing this, they put, I think, 40 hours a week supporting over and above Keyring. Now, within a year, we'd got that down to 3, and then after a couple of years, that just went, and he just had Keyring membership. He then also went on to be the first ever non-social worker to be a joint chair of a social work committee in his county. And for me, it's a bit perverse, but one of the best examples of his confidence is he resigned because he thought it was tokenism. And that to me was the ultimate, really, that he got that far, that he thought it wasn't good enough. So it's important. People then start to build up networks. You know, if you've only got a small group of people you deal with, then you know, how you're going to have diversity, how you're going to bring up other solutions, and that building up of networks outside your normal framework is important in terms of moving on from paid-for support. Workers become third parties. Although Jane said there we have workers, that the first layer of our support is volunteers, and it's important. It's a different perception. The members talk differently to volunteers. They talk differently about volunteers than they do about Keyring staff, let alone how they talk about social workers or the interaction there. What we want them to do then is to move beyond the volunteer side, so natural connections within the community and so on, so they don't need us anymore. And you know, paid support is not their lives and not their main part of their lives. That way they become less dependent on services. It's interesting now that there's a lot of interest in our service because actually that can be less money. So we have a lot of opportunities at the moment in this financial crisis. We move towards citizens rather than clients. The finances are much more fluid. You know, if it's not tied down and people can reduce their support, that money can be used elsewhere. And you can provide services for more people. The alternative then, the deficit model, exactly the opposite. Start off by highlighting weaknesses. And there's all sorts of things that contribute to that happening. Funding and benefits. You know, I know parents who have had to have, it's taken about 2 hours to fill in a benefits form for their child. And it's taken about an hour to come out of it, because they've basically spent 2 hours running their child down, listing everything they can't do and how useless they are. And so you then have to spend an hour saying, oh, yeah, but you remember they can do this, they can play the piano, they can do... You know, it's geared the wrong way. And it can be quite demoralising. So if you recognise the weaknesses, the first thing you do is you have to compensate for those. And that means more support. And if you've got more support, then that can lead to more anxiety, lethargy, pessimism. You know, in other words, you increase the dependency by identifying that there's a need there in the first place and starting with that need. People become, I think that was a Freudian slip, people belong to services. I think some people become services. I think at a certain level people are identified purely by the support that they're given, not by how they are as an individuals. And interestingly enough, I think services become dependent on them. Both as individual service providers, individuals in the service providers, but also the services in terms of the money they get from it. You know, do they give that up? We did have one case where another provider was providing some of the personal care for one of the people who was in our network. We really struggled to suggest the fact that this person probably didn't need their teeth brushing for them. And it was quite clear that the dependency was on the carer's behalf, not on, and this was a paid carer, not a family carer, rather than the person themselves. And so, we need to break that cycle. I mentioned work has become the centre of people's lives, and there's lots of examples in terms of circles of support and circles of social connections, and how the impact those have on people's identity and their worth and their interactions and their skills. Oops. Carries on to be an increased dependency on services, which again cost more money, and that's not there at the moment. They become clients rather than citizens. They become identified by that label. Finances get locked up in those people and can't be released to do sort of preventative work or other more imaginative stuff, and therefore their services a few people. What is interesting about those two models is they are both self-fulfilling. And overall, they probably take about the same amount of effort. Although the one reduces the amount of resources that need to go in later on, the first one, the other one tends to make them either static or make them increase. If you start at the right point, then the one will follow around to the other. You perhaps need to decide, or we need to decide, if we built a deficit approach, why have we done that? Why have we started at that point, and how can we break that? Because it leads to all sorts of peculiar battles then in terms of, are you the right sort of disabled person? Are you worthy enough? Are you heroic? Or are you one of the scary group that, you might need to, be locked up? There's all sorts of battles that start for, you have, if you're starting from the wrong point in terms of a deficit-based. It also makes it more difficult to say, because generally speaking, as you might guess from this, Keyring's view is that a lot of people are over-supported. Now that's quite hard, as a parent say, if you've been told that your child is not capable of these things, to then suggest, or for us to come along and suggest, well, actually perhaps they don't need the same sort of support. How can you equate those two? It doesn't make sense, let alone what it might say about, well, have I made the wrong decision for them? Choice. Well, choice, that's an interesting one. Choice really is dictated by context. What choices are available to you? I suppose more, what choices are made available or deemed appropriate for you? So we don't all have the same choices. We're not all given the same information. For years, social workers in the UK, it's quite explicit that they should assess people's needs based on what those needs are, not on what services they know will be available to meet those needs. I have never yet come across a social worker who's done that. They are human, and inevitably, if they assess somebody and think, oh, there's no way they're going to get that, then they will tend to, assess the needs on what they know is available. Now, the difficulty with that, of course, is it then hides the need in the first place, and you'll never break that cycle, and things will just go backwards and forwards. But that's that human sort of aspect that you didn't even get that information to make that choice. In Keyring, because we do a lot around community connections and other forms of support for people, we are very keen on it. In fact, sometimes we're contractually obliged to measure what community connections we make for people. Now, I have to say, on those contracts where you have to do that, if they did it on me, I would be non-compliant. But that's my choice to be miserable and to sit in my own house and not talk to my neighbours, and nobody questions it particularly. Well, some people might, but I mean, it doesn't mean I'm going to change my support or get different money. So, real difference. Members have to sort of do that, and that becomes ingrained, internalised form of dependency, which comes out at times. I mean, I mentioned now a member trustee, and one of the other trustees at the moment, who's a member of Keyring, who used to live in an institution, now lives on his own, he will still ask me if he can go to the toilet. And I'm thinking, how can that be? No, I would never ask him at that situation. I would explain, but it wouldn't ask permission in terms of that. So it's quite ingrained, and that's for somebody who's in charge of a £4 million organisation. Shouldn't have that sort of thought really. And if we talk about housing choice, Martin said this morning about what's preferable in terms of people's, and absolutely I would agree with him. In the UK, buying your property, thanks to Maggie Thatcher, is it. If you don't do that, you're on to third choice. Forget second choice. That's very strong. Whether private rental or social rental is your next choice is a grey area, and I said we could discuss that for ages. I think it depends on what class you're from, where you live, and what the social housing is like, and all sorts of different factors. But nevertheless, it's more or less in that order. If you're disabled or including a Keyring member, then your first option is probably none. You're in that group home. You might convert it into independent living, which means you have a tenancy attached to your name, but I'm not sure that makes much difference in terms of who you live with and where you live. Next one is social housing, which means that you're going to live in certain areas, and I would absolutely agree with other speakers who've talked about the fact that those areas should be good anyway, and certainly if there's a community in that area, then that's great. But there's a lot of people in the UK who have disabled children. There's a lot of older parents who have disabled children who would class themselves as middle class and wouldn't dream of their child going to live in a council estate or a social housing area. Have they got another choice? The next choice is private housing, and that's increasing a lot for Keyring members because social housing isn't available, and there's pluses and minuses to that. And a few disabled people buy their properties. Still very small, growing slightly, but it's still quite tiny. But if we think about what that means in terms of housing, what does it mean in terms of status? How important is owning a property or having a choice over your property important to you as a person, as an identity? And therefore, if you haven't got that same choice, what does that highlight? And again, generally speaking, if you haven't got the same choice as others, what others seem to think is normal, then how is that going to impact you on as an individual in terms of your identity and status? And I think that's enormously important. Next one is control, and I'm going to go a bit off-piste here really and just give a very personal opinion, and you may disagree with it. We won't have time to debate it, but I had a little debate with Elizabeth, who's here, about it. My personal view is that we have lots of choices in life. We don't have any control over which of those choices we make at that particular point. Billions and billions of events, and thoughts, both ours and others, accumulate to get to that point where we have a choice to make, and we do that. The idea for me that you then somehow have some objectivity at that point that isn't informed by that billions and billions of thoughts and events and history doesn't make sense. Okay? Nor in terms of the consequences of those choices. So in some ways you could say it's a sort of, for me it's an existential extrapolation. This is philosophy, so the French will be fine with us. Existential extrapolation of what Anatoly France said in this classic quote, which a number of you will know, about the law being equal, because a rich man can't steal bread or live under a bridge any more than a poor man. Again, it's context. What choices do we have, and what ability do we have to make those choices? So the idea of control, I think, is a bit alien. Now, one of the issues with that, of course, is you might say, well, where does the responsibility come from? Where does change come from if that's the case, if we don't have that control over that side? Well, equally, those billions and billions of events and of thoughts by other peoples can lead to good things, and they can lead to more things being on people's menu of choices that they have. And just to give you a quick example, in 1990, a group of people in London were listening to some people with intellectual disabilities who said they wanted to live on their own and wanted to live independently. Now, in 1990, I can assure you that was quite an off-the-wall idea. But that group of people listened to them and didn't dismiss it. And eventually that became Keyring. And as I said, later on, we are now 100 of these networks, 950 people, and we have the network in Roscommon. And because of the connection with Roscommon and the connection with Noeline, I'm now standing here telling you about Keyring. So things do change, and the world has changed and can continue to change. Freedom. As you might imagine, if we can't be independent and we're interdependent and we have no control over the choices we make, then how can we really have freedom? And is that very depressing? Is that a problem? Well, I guess we can have freedom from some things. Eleanor Roosevelt's thing about no one can make you feel inferior without your consent is all very well. It's probably a lot easier to do that if you're the wife of a US president than it is if you're somebody who has been told that they're useless and have got no value and has never been merited. So, so perhaps we should have some freedom from assumptions. Perhaps that should be an ambitious ambition in terms of ourselves. Now, me, I'm white, English, male, middle class, middle-aged. So many might assume that I know what I'm talking about. Equally, a number of people might assume that what I say doesn't merit listening to because of that list of things. And certainly I would say one of my favourite quotes is, "A flow of words is no proof of wisdom." So everything should be tested in terms of that. But imagine if the assumption removes your freedom to be involved in things. It affects your life to such a great extent. In a previous job, I supported one of our trustees who had an intellectual disability. He was starved of oxygen at birth, and he had real trouble with speech and in some ways memory. And I was helping him talk to a group of university students, and I had to feed him lines because that's what we agreed we would do, and we'd agreed what he was going to say beforehand. And the point he made was because he had difficulty in speech and he couldn't read either, people assumed he didn't understand. And I can assure you he understood very well. Now, when we do that with a toddler, it's quite amusing because there's that bit before they can actually talk when you suddenly realise, oh my goodness, they've understood the last 6 months. But for Reg, it infected his whole life, the choices he could make, who he could live with. Now, eventually, he got married and he had his own home and stuff like that, so it moved on. But for most of his childhood, it really restricted because of the assumptions that were made on certain aspects of it. Now, I was like quoting people that I'm not overly fond of to see what they can do. Now, George Bush, and here I'm sure he was talking about Iraq or Afghanistan here, he said we can't impose freedom, but we can eliminate the roadblocks to freedom to allow free societies to develop. And I guess that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about removing some of the freedom from stereotyping, from interpretations, from assumptions, and to do that. I think this is a bit ironic because it's from a country who thinks they're free, and I have to say I don't think they are. That's, again, probably another talk. Daily lives, well, what constitutes daily lives is so broad, I'm really not sure how that's going to be applied. That seems so subjective in terms of that. Now, I have to say I'm a little bit nervous about this next bit because when I was doing this, I wanted to sort of put a joke in here, and I put a joke in about the author Geoffrey Archer, a bit of a running gag really, and formerly Lord Archer. And then I realised how many lawyers were on the list of attendees. However, I assume you're all housing lawyers, not libel lawyers, so we'll see if we can get away with it really. But the same as any other person. I mean, to me, this is the most ridiculous aspect of this statement. What do they mean? Do they mean black and white? Do they mean male or female? Christian or Muslim? Able-bodied or disabled? Young or old? As Geoffrey Archer comes in. Unknown or famous? Cleared or convicted? I realise it's probably... That's Redknapp, in case the people don't know who was cleared of money. Entitled or titled? What do they mean by this? It is a peculiar concept, really. And you could go on. You could go on gay, straight. what do they mean in terms of that? And I don't know, do they mean them and us? Is that what it comes down to? It seems such a broad statement in terms of that. There is some hope in that. In the sense, if it is that unclear, what are we talking about? Are we therefore talking about the lowest common denominator, or are we talking about the highest standard? And I guess it's our job to ensure it's the latter rather than the former in terms of the ambitions that we have for the people we support. So, is there hope? Yes, there is. I have to say I have more bouts of pessimism than I used to have. I have some, with local authorities, we have two sorts of conversations. We have a conversation that says to address this financial crisis we need to do something radically different, and those are lovely. And then we have conversation with other local authorities and other people in the same local authority that says you've got to do it for less money and you've just got to do this. And those are really new. Again, apologies for the translators, and we're having both those extremes. However, there are many more opportunities. They are strategically thinking differently. We are here today. We have progressed. We do have that model. As they would say in America, hell yes, there is opportunity in terms of that. And Roscommon is, I suppose, one of the latest examples. And all I need to do is to go out and talk to some of our members, to go to a volunteer event, and suddenly I remember what it's all about and the fact that things have moved on, and we can carry on with that. So we should celebrate what we're doing and reflect why it's worked and just apply that more often. Thank you.